Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. That is for being codependent. Now in your 20s, you're exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in crap relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Today, we have Ben Fineman. He is a psychotherapist in Los Angeles who specializes in helping young professionals and creatives find greater success in their personal and professional lives. He holds a BS in Business Administration from Boston University and an MA in Clinical Psychology from the University of the West. Ben is a former professional high-stakes poker player and co-host of the Very Bad Therapy podcast. Ben Fineman, thank you for coming on.
Hi, Marissa. It's wonderful to talk to you as always.
Wonderful to talk to you too. So this is the Codependummy podcast. How do you define codependency? We'll start with that. How do you define codependency, Ben?
So I have an interesting response to this question because I have had to spend time Googling in advance and thinking about codependency. It's nothing that I've ever thought about in terms of coming up with a specific definition. And I realized along the way that part of that, I think A, is because I don't know if I recognize a lot of codependent traits in myself, which doesn't mean that they're not there. Mm-hmm. But B, I think as a man, being socialized into this world as a man, codependency isn't something that I've thought about extensively because I think especially as a white man, I was sort of raised to put my needs above others, not so much by my family, but as, society sort of suggests my level of importance compared to other people. Mm-hmm. So I really had to do a lot of Googling to figure out not so much what codependency is, but the textbook definition and then how I feel about it. And so I guess where I've arrived is just maybe the most basic definition is putting your needs behind somebody else's and potentially even taking that on as your identity. So however that looks, and I know it's pretty common in relationships where one person might have an addiction, or in relationships where one person kind of takes a dominant role in the relationship in a way that might not be healthy for all individuals. But at its core, it's kind of subverting your own needs in favor of somebody else's, not because it's what you actually want, but what you've been socialized to do or raised to do as a way of kind of getting along with other people or simply surviving in the world.
Mm-hmm. I am so impressed with your ability to translate what you found on Google. That is an amazing, you just captured it so well. So subverting your needs, right? Putting your needs below someone else's, likely because you've been raised to do that, reinforced societally, and for survival, right? We don't think that we're gonna die, but we act like it.
Yeah, and I think on some core level, there is a very real fear that it's sort of linked to some kind of annihilation. Mm-hmm. This idea that if the person that you rely on most, and when we grow up, it's our parents, and when we're growing up, it's our parents, and when we later grow up and become adults, it's our partner or partners. And there's a very real feeling that if we lose them, we'll be alone in the world. And it traces back to a kind of childhood fear that we need others to be there for us. We need to know that somebody's there for us in crisis.
Right.
And if the best way that we've learned to do that is by putting our needs second, because there's a risk that by expressing what we want, we might push other people away, then it just leads to these ineffective patterns in relationships where I don't think ultimately either person is truly happy, because if both people aren't able to express their needs, it's not an authentic relationship. You're not showing up with somebody else authentically in a way that feels expansive. You're kind of narrowed into what one person needs. And I think in the long run, there's always going to be cracks in that foundation.
Right. Again, I'm so impressed with your your Googling skills and ability to translate that. So, right, I asked you to come on. I was like, come with some funny stories about codependency in your own life, how you conceptualize it. And you're like, oh my God, how does it come up in my own life? How do I conceptualize it?
Mhm.
And now that you have,
That was my exact inner monologue, by the way. That was
yes,
exactly it.
I mean, reflecting on the research you did, I sense your ability to translate it is because you have experienced it. And so, what's like one experience you have of codependency in your young adulthood?
So I'm 37 now, and the first relationship I was ever in um, was when I was 19 to 32. Um, and I think this is where I need some of your help as the expert on codependency, because I was asking my fiance now, like what he thinks, and trying to get a sense of what he's recognized in myself that is kind of codependent traits, and reflecting on my past, because my relationship with my first partner was not particularly healthy in some ways. I think as a whole, it was a very functional, a very happy and healthy relationship for the most part. But I had not really matured because we got together when I was still in the closet when I was 19. So I had no experience growing up essentially as an independent person. And so I defined myself through the relationship. And so this is where I think I need your help, because I have a hard time saying, is X, Y, and Z an expression of codependent behavior? And I think that's just how I am with like language in general. It's hard for me to just place labels on things,
Right.
which is a whole other conversation. So I don't know if it's a funny story, but it in reflecting on my experience in that relationship, maybe you can give me some feedback and say, yes, this sounds codependent or not, or what aspects of it, or just ask questions to help me understand, because I genuinely have a huge mental block because I've never really been raised to look at it in that perspective.
Right.
So it's kind of like free therapy. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's free associate. Just
That's
what comes to your mind, Ben?
that's the reason I came on the podcast, is to like on the sly get some free therapy from you.
Yeah. So 19 years old,
Yes.
you
And what
meet
I oh no, go ahead.
you meet this partner, man,
Mhm.
and for 13 years you were together.
Yeah.
Healthy-ish,
Healthy-ish. I mean,
functional.
the healthiest I think he and I could do. And a lot of that was my own limitations. And I think where I'm curious about if you feel like it fits into like a codependent framework is it was very hard for me to define my own sense of well-being outside of how the relationship was going. And so I've never had trouble expressing my needs in relationships. If anything, I express my needs too much. I get a kind of anxiety when things feel distant or things don't feel as good as they were the day before. Even if we've been together for a decade, it's hard for me to feel that stability, because in the moment there's that kind of like deep core distress that my partner isn't there for me. And so what would happen is if we were having struggles in the relationship, it would be very hard for me to just like exhale and feel a sense of stability, not just about the relationship, but about myself. And I would need to have conversations as quickly as possible to kind of alleviate some of that stress, to work things out. And he was somebody who would need time to process. So that never worked as a strategy to actually get my needs met, to feel closer together. And what would happen over time is the recognition that if things were challenging between he and I was sort of on my own, because he had to go through his process and my process involved him. And if he wasn't there in that moment, I felt like a heightened anxiety where it really wouldn't be possible, based on what I knew at the time, based on my emotional immaturity at the time. It really wouldn't be possible for me to recognize what was happening and stop and say, here's what I need to do to take care of myself. It's okay if things aren't great right now or tomorrow or next week. Like, we have security in the long run, and we'll come back together. And so in those moments, I kind of lost myself, and I felt like something wasn't right within me because something wasn't right between us. And
Right.
I know you asked for a funny story. Nothing about that is going to make you laugh. But I guess I'm curious, does that sound like it fits into like an idea of codependency? And if so, like what you see in it?
Do you sense that you can give a more specific example of this dance where there was tension and he was like, I need space. You were like, I need to talk. He's like, I need space. You're like, okay. Like, what comes to mind?
I mean, I think something that was an ongoing challenge for us was he was just very busy with his career. And so, you know, the field he worked in, at times he wouldn't have a lot of work, and at times he would have a ton of work. And that was just the nature of what he did for a living. And so when he was busy, I would feel abandoned, even though it wasn't about me at all in retrospect. And I would talk to him and say, you know, this is really hard. I know you don't have a lot of time, but even just like acknowledging that this is a short-term thing, that you miss me, those simple words that let me know that you're thinking of me even when I don't see you for, you know, an entire day or week, etc. It means the world, because even though rationally I'm aware that you love me, there's this core need that I need to have met, which is just the reminder of that.
Right.
And so we'd have that conversation, and he would feel like he was doing everything he could. I remember the way it was phrased once is that he has like 5% of his life to himself outside of work, and he was giving me that entire 5%. And to me, I couldn't get past the fact that I needed more than the 5%. So it felt like it wasn't enough. And he got the message he was inadequate, and just kind of like pulled back, because if you're doing everything you can to, you know, advance your career, but then also everything you can in your spare time to try and take care of your relationship and your partner, and it doesn't feel like enough, there's really nothing else you can do. And so his solution, as is the solution for a lot of people, is to say, if I can't get it right no matter what, like, why try as hard?
Right.
And so he would invest more of his time in work, because at least there he was appreciated for the efforts he was putting in. And that just made me feel more detached, more distant.
Abandoned.
Yeah. And so it would just create the cycle where he was essentially protecting himself by withdrawing, and I was trying to get my needs met by going to him as much as possible. And I imagine it was just quite difficult for him in those moments, because there literally was nothing else he could do short of essentially quitting his job, which is not realistic either. And so it was my own internal stress, and I think inability to feel that sense of internal stability when things between he and I weren't great. Does that answer the question?
Right. It just sounds like, going back to your definition and what really resonated with you, putting your needs below someone else's, subverting your needs below someone else's for maintenance of a relationship, for survival. For 13 years, you did that.
I think it's a really interesting way to think about it, because I don't know if it was necessarily me doing those things, putting my needs second. It was me feeling like I can't get them to be first in his eyes. And in retrospect, I don't think that was true. But so I guess that's why I'm curious if this feels like codependency, because it wasn't so much coming from within. It was the feeling like there's nothing I can do to get my needs met, and just raise that level of relationship tension as we went. So I don't know if that's codependency, but it's an interesting dynamic nonetheless.
Well, what do you sense, right? 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4, right? Subverting your needs for, you know, maybe you wanted 10% or 20%, right? He's giving you 5, 6 year, 7 year, 8 year, 9, right? I just, like, his needs were clear. I am focused on my career. You get 5%. If and when there's an issue, I need space. And you're like, 5% sounds good. Of course, you're focusing on your career. And look, we've been together a decade.
Oh, yeah. I think I was lost in thought, lost in the memories. Yeah, it wasn't that way for the entirety of the relationship. It was really the last 4 or 5 years, which is probably why those were the last 4 or 5 years.
Right.
But it was the feeling of not being able to have my needs met, which I think at some point creates a kind of internal tension where I have to decide for myself, is this enough? Even if I love somebody, is this enough? Is it okay for me to say there are going to be long periods of time where I only get 5%? And, in the moment, it was a long time ago now that we separated, but in the moment, the answer became no. It sort of stopped being okay because the problems that we had expanded from our relationship into just me as a person, and not really having that period of time in my 20s where I learned who I was, how I wanted to exist in the world, what gave the world a sense of meaning and fulfillment. I had invested those answers in my former partner. Things just kind of felt a sense of there's a sense of emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people who experience codependency probably can relate to that, where at some point there's a realization that they're not focusing on their own needs, whether that's because they've been raised by their family that way, or raised by or influenced by society that way, or it's just a survival mechanism, that at some point there is kind of an internal clash of, I can keep doing this, but I won't necessarily be happy or leading a life that feels fulfilling because the energy I'm investing isn't towards something that makes me feel like I'm taking care of myself.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I hear you, your needs were not being met, but there was a hierarchy of priorities for your partner, and he was at his max. You worked, maintained, fought for that being okay, and discovered, while I'm neglecting my needs and staying in this relationship, I'm feeling emptier and emptier.
Yeah.
And I want to go get my needs met with myself or with someone else.
Yeah. And at the time, when we separated, I don't think I knew what those needs were, because I had figured out who I was in the context of a relationship.
Right.
And so it wasn't as clear to me then as it is now that there were, specific needs, things that I find fulfilling in life now. I didn't really know what those things were. I just felt uncertain of who I was, uncertain of what I wanted, but I knew that what I had wasn't it. And defining myself by my relationship to somebody else, or not really establishing a sense of personal identity independent of relationships with other people, left me feeling like when things in the relationship weren't going well, there really wasn't anything there to fall back on internally. And so I guess, again, I don't know if that would fit into the codependent bucket, but I think there's a lot of overlap where people who define themselves by how they're viewed in the eyes of other people find it very difficult to not be in the gaze of others and just be alone with themselves, because there's not always a kind of depth of self-awareness or identity or a connection to what feels truly important to you, because that's nothing that you've ever had cultivated or allowed yourself to cultivate, because it's sort of been subverted in favor of taking care of other people or just defining yourself by your relationships to other people.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know. I don't sense that you were codependent with and on him, but with and on the relationship. Because you said when the relationship was good, I was good. So the needs of the relationship were paramount in me feeling good about myself that day. If the relationship was down, that was the priority to get it back up. I was codependent in my comfort, contentedness, dependent on the status and quality of the relationship.
Yeah, I think that's spot on.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that when we separated, a month later, I was like, okay, time to just find a new relationship, because I was distressed. I was living on my own for the first time, really anxious, still hadn't really done a whole lot of work on myself. And I figured the solution is to just find another relationship, which of course was doomed to fail. And so I tried that for a few months until I realized there was just no chance of finding a meaningful relationship when I'm using it as a way to alleviate my anxieties about myself.
Mm-hmm.
which was not a fun period in time, certainly, because those are painful realities to accept. But I think they're very important realities to accept. And it's always going to be worth it, because at some point you come out on the other side feeling okay about yourself. And I think that's when you can actually start having healthy, happy, long-term relationships, is when, it starts from within. It's, if you don't love yourself, how can you, is that the saying? Something like that. If you don't love yourself, how can you love somebody else, or how can others love you? Right. Something along those lines.
So I have some questions about your professional experience and work with clients, but now I just want to stay on this.
Free therapy. I'm in.
I mean, so being codependent on being in a relationship and that relationship doing well, right? If we're solid, I'm solid. If we're rocky, I'm anxious. And now I'm single after 13 years. And 30 days later, right, the emptiness I felt in the relationship is now met with the emptiness I sense on my own. Oh, I just need to find another relationship.
Yeah. And part of it, and I think a lot of the kinds of people that I work with professionally, and I think that you work with as well, are professionally successful, right? They followed certain steps, maybe went to college, got a graduate degree, or maybe, went into the workforce at a high school and had success. But one way or another, they've followed a path that was kind of laid out for them, where they assumed this is what I need to be happy. And I had a very fortunate, first career. I enjoyed what I did. As you mentioned in the intro, I played poker for a living. I lived in Las Vegas. Like teenage Ben would have been just thrilled with what 25-year-old Ben was doing. Mm-hmm. And so I had all these things in my life that suggested I should be happy, and I wasn't. And I think when that's the case, it becomes very easy, if you don't do the internal work, to project those feelings outward. To say, if I'm not happy, well, it must be because my partner isn't doing something right, because look at all these other great things I have in my life. I have a loving and supportive family. I have 3 rescue pugs. I had the life I wanted, and I wasn't happy deep down. And so it's very easy to say it's probably his fault. And so when we split up, the natural conclusion that I had was, well, just find the right partner and everything will be fine, which of course is a complete fallacy, but it's a lot easier than being able to look within and recognize your own areas for growth. The work that you haven't done yet. It can be really scary to recognize that you're not necessarily the person you thought you were, and that there's a whole lot of like existential anxiety in front of you about having to create your own sense of meaning in the world. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people just arrive there right away. I think they have to go through some things and find themselves there. And that was kind of my path in the initial months after separating from my partner, was to say, I'll just find a newer, better partner, which is completely missing the point and also unfair to my former partner to suggest that it was really anything at all to do with him. We had our challenges, but I don't know if like even the best couples therapy would have saved our relationship, which in the long run I think is for the better. But I needed to do a lot of work on myself to get to a place where I was okay if things in a relationship weren't okay.
Right. So you're bringing me back to my early 20s, because I was heavily codependent on my first alcoholic boyfriend. We broke up. I took a year from dating because I recognized how unhealthy it was. And then I met a sober alcoholic, right? So much better. And was super codependent with him. And, right, you talked about how you broke up, took a month, started looking for another relationship, right? And same thing when this second relationship fell apart, right? This internally, there was this recognition. I hadn't actually done that much work in between those two. It was the same relationship. He just happened to be sober. Right. But yeah, it was the same, just toxicity, codependency. And right after it fell apart, there was this teeny tiny gnawing. Like, I need to be alone and I need to work on whatever it is that keeps drawing me like a moth to a flame to these relationships. And you had like a similar like, oh God, I got to work on and find myself.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get to that? And how did you actually listen to that?
Let's see. So it was probably about 7 months or so. Yeah, probably about 7 months or so between when my ex-partner and I separated. So we were living in Las Vegas. I moved to LA.
What happened to the pugs?
Oh, that's a good question. So he and I had a house together, and I just decided like I need just kind of a change of scenery, and so we agreed that everything was amicable. It was in retrospect a really great separation, but he would keep the house, and it didn't really make sense to take the dogs out of the house, and so after 6 months or so, he realized that having 3 pugs and a full-time job, and now also for him being single for the first time in a while, taking care of 3 pugs was too much. So he kept one of the 3, and the other 2 went to live with my mom, who I'm close with, and she lives near me, so I see them all the time.
Wow.
So that's everything with the pugs had a happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so within like 4 weeks after we separated, I left, and I went from Vegas to LA. And yeah, after a month or 2, started dating again. I met a guy online who lived in New York, and I like flew to spend time with him, and what I thought was falling in love, but what was really just getting rid of my internal anxieties about being alone. I think it's very easy to mistake having strong feelings for somebody else with feeling better about yourself. And so that ended shortly, just in the recognition that I was on the wrong track. I tried, using dating apps, and I tell you, when you go from like a closeted 19-year-old to a single 32-year-old in like the world of dating apps when you're gay, it's like you realize that this entire new wide world exists of meeting people and hooking up and all of this stuff. And no judgment whatsoever. It's just not the lifestyle for me. It's not something that gives me a sense of like fulfillment. And so I tried that for a bit and realized I wasn't going to find any sense of like peace of mind from casual sex. And at some point, after trying a few relationships and recognizing like there was something, like I think you said, like gnawing, there's something like deep down that clearly wasn't being met. I came to the recognition that I just needed time for myself, and I didn't know what for, and I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew that after 7 months of trying to feel better about separating from my ex, trying to feel better using men either in relationships or, just like one-off encounters, that I needed just time, like distance from all of it and just time for myself. And so I started actually reading books on like Buddhist philosophy, like Eastern psychology. I think something that really stuck with me was by author Pema Chodron. The idea that we all live in a state of groundlessness, a state of impermanence, and there are going to be a lot of times where things aren't okay. And in those moments, we have no choice but to accept that they aren't okay. And that isn't resignation and not doing anything about it, but it's to say, if in this moment you're not feeling great or something is difficult in your life, sometimes there is nothing you can do about it, and you have to be able to accept that and decide from that point on what you want to do about it, rather than fight things that are out of your control. And I knew in that moment I just needed time to allow things to not be okay. I didn't know what that looked like, but I started reading more books that kind of fit along those lines, where it gave me a sense of peace in impermanence, in struggle, in fear of being alone, in feelings of abandonment and loneliness, and just the terrifying nature of living by yourself for the first time at 32, after you've sort of lived the life you thought you wanted in your 20s. There's really no way to put a shine on that and to say this is great. It sucks.
Right.
And there are a lot of times in relationships where things suck, and it doesn't have to reflect on yourself, and it doesn't have to reflect on anything but the fact that this is how the world is and that relationships can be complicated. And I needed a good bit of time to be with those kinds of thoughts and find that sense of peace of mind within myself, so that whether it was something in a future relationship or in life in general, that I wouldn't be defined by my external circumstances, because we can't control those a lot of the time. And life is pretty tough when you define your own sense of well-being by how things are outside of yourself.
That is what codependents do.
Yeah.
Right? Especially, you know, just hearing you, I know, again, in my 20s, I think in a lot of our listeners, young adulthoods, we completely define ourselves and our worth by being in relationship. And it is with partners. So I'm worthy because someone loves me or someone is interested. And I'm also worthy because my parents are approving of me. My friends think I am the most reliable and best friend they could have. My employers adore me. I just loved being adored. Like, I just remember like my employers, they'd be like, "Oh, Marissa." And I was like, "Oh, yes." Right? Like, so dependent on my external environment, looking a certain way, meeting an expectation. And then here's Pema, right? Here's Ben, heartbroken, starting to recognize the patterns and really rejecting that idea that I'm only worthy in relationship.
Yeah. And I think when I hear you describe it, that's exactly right. But in the moment, it wasn't so much a rejection as like a very slow process of change. I didn't have like, an epiphany where I read like one line and I was like, life is great now. It was more of not really knowing what the future holds, but knowing that I want it to be different from the past. And I think for a lot of people, when they hear people like you and I talk about our paths with the perspective we have now, especially being therapists, I don't think our conversation quite captures what it feels like in the moment when your head is just spinning and you're like slowly awakening to ideas that things can be different, even if you don't have the words for it. You don't know what it looks like or how to get there. You just know that where you're at isn't where you want to be. And I think that was more of where I was in the moment. And incidentally, actually, so I've been with my fiance now for about 5 years. And I met him shortly after deciding, like, I just need time for myself, which is like the quintessential when you stop looking, you find what it is you're looking for. But it was tricky because, I didn't have expectations of, I had stopped looking for my next long-term partner. And I found someone who was pretty incredible. And I recognized that I still needed to do the work on my own, that I wasn't necessarily even capable of falling in love. And I didn't know when that would come back or what it would look like, or if it was even possible. I just knew in the moment, like, I was kind of a mess. And we had some incredible, honest conversations where I wasn't trying to please him. I wasn't trying to paint a picture of myself that was anything other than where I was at, which is like, I'm really not sure where I'm going. Not sure about relationships in general because I had some challenges in my last one, and I don't know how to regain the capacity to love, because at the moment it just felt like it had escaped me. And he just listened and said that it was okay. And that, I remember the words he used was that I was worth waiting for. And I was like, well, that's just incredibly sweet and beautiful. Now I'm kind of tearing up thinking about it. But I think it captures something incredible. And obviously he's incredible, but it captures something really important, which is these are things you can't rush. And if you have to do that work on your own, it doesn't come by wanting it more. It comes by like going through the hard times and allowing things to be groundless, and allowing things to be difficult, and recognizing that you kind of discover yourself by opening up to the entirety of your internal experience, that you discover who you are when you can connect with feelings of sadness and fear, and also all the wonderful things, the fulfilling aspects of life and the joy and the happiness. But if you sort of minimize yourself and your own needs, it becomes very hard to truly know who you are, because you're cutting yourself off from everything about who you are. Not everything, but a lot of the aspects of who you are, even the most difficult ones, which I think paradoxically can be the most important ones, because they help you kind of heal and grow from early life lessons you may have learned about why you aren't important or why your needs aren't important.
Mm-hmm. I heard you convey to your partner very early on when you had honest conversations with him, suggesting, I don't know if I have the capacity to love again. You were saying to him, I'm not dependent on this relationship. I'm not going to pretend, ignore, repress, appease. I'm going to be honest and upfront because I'm not dependent on this relationship being good for me to be good. And he's like, I am not dependent on it either. Like, you take your time. Thank you for your honesty. And let's see. I sense this is worth waiting for, but I'm not going to command or demand or freak out. Yeah, you guys are both like, yeah, we're not dependent on this relationship. Great. Let's both not be dependent.
I had never thought of it in those terms, but that feels exactly right. And it's kind of pretty awesome to look back. But again, in the moment, it was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea where my head is at. So just bear with me. But yeah, I think that's exactly right. It was saying, like, I want this to work, and you're incredible. But I also recognize that, like, I don't get to control what happens, and I have to just open myself up to my entire experience. And if that says it can't work, or I'm not ready, or any of those things, like, that has to be on the table, or else, I think it's something, I forget the exact words, but it was something that either you or a guest said in a previous episode, that, like, I think you had said it, that if, like, you can't say no, yes doesn't mean anything. If you
Corey
can't,
Rosenthal. Yeah. If you can't say no, your yes has no meaning.
Yeah. And if you can't say, like, this relationship might not work because of X, Y, and Z, then being in the relationship doesn't necessarily mean anything, because you're narrowing your experience together to only, like, we will marginalize our own needs so that the relationship survives. And I mean, I guess that becomes maybe too limiting of a thought, because oftentimes, if there's kids involved or other things that kind of define a relationship, but in the early stages of a relationship with no kids involved, if you've met somebody for a few months and you can't allow yourself to envision what it's like to be without them, I think you're relying on a future that you feel you need, because it reduces the anxieties of being alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that can have a long-term healthy ending, if you're limiting yourself to only one possibility in a relationship.
That's extremely codependent.
Yeah.
I will only be happy if we're together, and I can't even imagine or talk about us being apart.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How have you developed comfort, openness to being alone while being in a couple?
It's an interesting question. We're recording this on, like, the 1 year mark of the pandemic, and we both work from home now, so we're literally always together.
Ditto.
But before that, and this is interesting. So with my ex, he was busy and he would work long hours at times, but he rarely traveled for work. So I'd see him pretty much every day. And my fiance now, what he does for work actually takes him around the country. So for the few years before the pandemic that we were living together, there would be, maybe a third of the year he'd be gone. He'd be on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I couldn't have possibly imagined in my previous relationship. And it isn't easy.
Because you needed the proximity, you needed the daily temperature check.
Yeah. Without him present, I sort of lose a piece of myself, and not like in a Hallmark card kind of way.
And so I will, really quick, I'll just add, because I had this flash memory. When I dated the alcoholic, we were long distance, and if we didn't talk at the end of the day and I told him about my day didn't happen. Like if he fell asleep or was out with friends and we didn't talk, so empty. Like I needed it. I was, like I fell apart.
Yeah.
So yeah, right. You're like, I couldn't imagine being apart from current partner a third of the year, given how you were in your previous relationship. Continue.
Oh yeah. And I think it's been a tremendously valuable experience because it's forced me to grow. And, you know, when he took a job where he was going to be traveling a lot, I was apprehensive. I didn't feel like our relationship was threatened at all, which was a good sign. But I recognized my own inner anxieties, I think, which is also a good sign because they're not just going to magically disappear. And so I've really had to be very intentional about what happens when I have those feelings come up of being alone, of being abandoned, because they come up even if I can rationally identify that it has nothing to do with my fiance. And they come up even if I know the thoughts themselves are irrational. It's just how I'm wired, just given my background, given just my neurobiology. And so I've had to just learn to tolerate it, learn to find healthy ways of spending those nights, whatever that might be, you know, watching TV, talking with friends, meditating, just finding strategies. And it's sometimes I'll just kind of numb out, you know, I'll watch some stupid show on Netflix I've seen 100 times and have a drink or two and just feel like in the moment that's the best I got. But it's that constant reminder. It's recognizing where those feelings are coming from, that they have nothing to do with my fiance, that it's just how I orient myself to the world. And in those moments, you know, I can text him and just say hi. We can FaceTime. He knows how much I love getting because he'd frequently fly to the East Coast. So he'd be up 3 hours before I would. Actually, more like 6 because I like sleeping in. And so I'd wake up and have a text wishing me good morning most mornings. And just those little things. It's the same things I felt I wasn't getting from my ex, like the small reminders that he cares. And to be fair, I think my ex did those things. I just wasn't aware of how important they were to me. And so they kind of got minimized in my internal experience.
Right.
But it really is just expanding my distress tolerance, letting it be okay if I'm having those feelings and recognizing that feelings aren't facts, thoughts aren't facts. I can choose how to respond to them in the moment. And yeah, with COVID now, it'll be interesting to see if I've forgotten all the things I've learned about myself and how to be in a healthy relationship when I have these kinds of tendencies, because, you know, at some point soon he'll go back to being on the road a lot.
Right.
And I'll remember this conversation I'm having with you and be like, Marissa told me that was the right way to handle it. So I'm just going to keep on keeping on.
Right. And like even comparing your previous relationship, right? Part of you is like, I think I got those texts. I got that acknowledgement and recognition. But in this current relationship, right, you are receiving that, right? Getting your needs met. And you're also developing and learning to take care of and nourish your own. So if he is gone, you're like, Netflix, alcohol, call with friends, read Pema Chodron, meditate, do FaceTime, send him a text message. Like there's, right, you're just building and you have all these other, it's not loneliness. It's, right, there's this discovery of solitude, right? And like this recognition, like, right, rationally, you know, he's coming back, but emotionally, oh God. And then tending to that, right?
Yeah.
Not dismissing, repressing, criticizing yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're just in hearing you describe it, I was reflecting on a moment before COVID, where he was traveling. And one of the things that really helped kind of pull me out of my own low point was actually getting into philosophy. It's been something that I've just like, it's totally opened my eyes, and I absolutely love it. It's in some ways it's as helpful for me as personal therapy has been, just challenging ways of thinking and seeing new ways of kind of exploring the world mentally.
Who do
And
you
so,
really like reading?
I've just gone like head over heels into like existentialism. So Sartre, Camus,
Sartre, Camus.
all the real optimistic stuff. But I remember it's just at the forefront of my brain as we're having this conversation. There was a moment where he was traveling. My fiance was traveling maybe like a year and a half ago. And I had found this place near where we live where they have weekly philosophy lectures. And philosophy was something that I had never thought about for a second, until my mid-30s. It was the kind of hobby that I wouldn't even bother to take time to explore because it was something that interested me kind of independent of my relationship. And I was, I think, too wrapped up in wanting to do things with my ex because having like a hobby of my own almost felt like I was alone in a sense.
Yeah.
Like deep down, it wasn't really okay to nurture like a personal interest, like in depth outside of a relationship. And so philosophy was something that I just explored on my own. Admittedly, my fiance is also interested in it, but it's not something where it's a shared exploration. It's something that we can talk about, but I've found a love for on my own. And so I went to this lecture and I remember just feeling so happy in the moment because I was doing something that was like, it was like that kind of stuff massages my brain. It just feels great. And it was something I was doing by myself. I went by myself. And I was just in such a great mood. And I remember thinking like, I don't know if it was possible for me to feel this way 10 years ago.
Right.
I don't know if it was possible for me to do something completely on my own where it wasn't like I was sharing it with somebody that I was cultivating from within that I knew meant something for me and me alone. And there was something, I remember just walking back to my car, like having this like lightness about me because it was just an unusual feeling for me to be okay with something like that and not just be okay with it, but feel a deep sense of joy. And yeah, now that I'm talking about it, it just brings up like a bit of personal pride because it comes from growth to be able to do something like that when not really how you're hardwired initially.
For yourself, by yourself, of yourself, right? With this faint awareness that you're loved from afar.
Yeah.
But like, just really have the time to think about and pursue your own interests.
Yeah.
Interdependence at its finest.
So here's the beautiful part that was so my fiance now when we met online and he actually had that word in his dating profile that he was like a big proponent of the idea of interdependence. And I was like, I don't know what that means. So I looked it up. I was like, he's cute, but I don't know what this word means. So it's worth looking up to see, if I should message him. And I was like, oh shit, like that's what I'm looking for. This idea of interdependence.
Ben, I mean, again, I am reminded of these honest conversations you two had, right? Where underneath what is spoken, you are both conveying, I'm not dependent on this relationship. Right? And that's what he was saying. He's like, we are not going to be dependent on this relationship. We are going to have a healthy reliance on ourselves, like as a couple, and then a healthy reliance on ourselves as individuals, and then other people too.
Yeah. And then COVID, where now we can only be dependent on each other because we share a small little 800 square foot space and one bathroom. It's hard to be completely interdependent when, you hear each other down the hall 24/7.
Well, thank you so much. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. Where can listeners find you?
Yeah, my professional website is benfinemancounseling.com. And I am always interested in hearing from really everybody. If there's anything that, Marissa, you and I talked about that sparks any listeners' interest, I just love talking about these ideas. So always happy to chat with anybody who wants to reach out.
We'll put your contact information in the show notes. And how are you feeling after this therapy session?
Good. Will I be receiving an invoice? Do you take Venmo?
No invoice, but yeah, I had my questions prepared today, and also since, right from your examples, being able to talk through that, it will be very relatable, fruitful for everybody listening. So thank you for opening up. Hey sis, it's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster, I'm a quote podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end, and know this. If you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you feel like you don't matter, know that you matter to me. Until next time, be sure to check out codependummy.com for more info about today's episode, my free course, and other resources. Take care. You're still here? Just kidding. Girl, this is not therapy, and I'm not your therapist, okay? This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the publisher, or the guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you want or need a professional, you should find one.